Welcome to Dev Bootcamp Life, the podcast where we help you level up so you land your first engineering job, and we help you level up so you become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter. And today we're going to be talking about Vue Js. So Vue Js is a front-end JavaScript framework, and they dub themselves as the progressive front-end JavaScript framework. We're going to get into what that means and how it's kind of distinct from some of the bigger players out there. As many of our listeners can recall, we've actually done a podcast about front-end frameworks before, as well as about single-page applications specifically. So those can be great accompanying episodes to listen to along with this one here. But today, we're going to be focused in on Vue Js. So that, by the way, that's spelled V-U-E, which is I believe the French pronunciation for the word view, which is V-I-E-W. But anyway, it's Vue Js is how we refer to it. Juan, what's kind of your experience with Vue, or what do you know about Vue before we get started?
Vue. So I haven't used it professionally before. I have played with it just at an academic level, yeah, right? Just to explore what it offers, the hello world, like very basic stuff. Um, I remember it was really easy to set up, and I remember something really cool at the time. This was maybe 3 years ago. It had a CLI. I think it was more than 3 years ago. I think Angular didn't even have a CLI. I think it was a long time ago. They had a really cool CLI, and I really liked the fact that they had a graphic CLI. So I would run the CLI, and it would have a UI where I could do Vue things. So I remember that. I think it was the Vue one, which is something that I don't remember seeing from the Angular. I don't know if the Angular has one like that right now, but that was pretty cool because it's easier, clicking something is easier than remembering commands. I remember it was very fast. I remember that the syntax was like alternative. I mean, it's still JavaScript, but I mean that I remember that I was able to define my template code and my presentation code, my styles, and then my logic, like my class, in the same file. I had that option, but I think I could do it also as separate files. But I remember that it was just easier to do it in the same file. So there was like a nice application of separation of concerns because it was not at the file level, but still you had your concerns as separate blocks on the same file using special tags to define which piece is which. So that reminds me a lot of React when you define your JavaScript inside your HTML, and you can define some CSS also there or inline styles, or well, not inline styles, but like styles that you can apply that the React engine will interpret and apply in the browser like normal CSS. But you never write CSS in React really like normal CSS. I mean, not when you use it that way. So that was pretty cool. I remember something I wonder is like, why do they call it the progressive JavaScript framework? Why is it progressive?
That's a really great question. So just a teeny bit of history to start answering that question is, so the gentleman who initially started this project, and now it is a full-blown open source project that's run by lots of different individuals as part of the Vue core team. But the person who started it was this guy named Evan You, and he was working at Google on the Angular JS or Angular version 1 project team. And he eventually was thinking like, hey, I really like some of the ideas that Angular JS is using here, but I wanted to have a more simplified version of it without all of the overhead or everything that you get along with Angular when you get that. So the idea of the progressive front-end JavaScript framework is that there's a few key pieces that make up front-end applications these days. But the thing is, not all front-end applications need all these different pieces. So let's talk about them. Number one is the ability to have a two-way binding between your JavaScript variables and your template, your Vue, and having some way of writing out your template to be able to bind those values together. And we're going to get into more of these kind of details as we go along, but that's kind of one of the core pieces, and that's what makes up the core of this, of many of these frameworks. In addition to that, there is a router, which again, not necessarily all applications, web apps need a router. So the idea about it being progressive is that the router, in a sense, is optional. If you don't need it, don't add it. Don't bundle it in. It doesn't add any weight to your application, and just use the template Vue rendering engine. But if you need the router, it's easy to plug in. Another aspect of the progressive framework is state management. So if you're familiar with Redux or RxJS, there's a lot of ways of managing state management from a global perspective in the browser. Vue's version is called Vuex or Vuex. I'm certainly not going to debate anybody on what you want to call it, but that is Vue's state management system, or at least the official one that you can use. And then lastly, one of the newer kind of pieces that comes out about the progressive framework aspect is the idea of doing server-side rendering, or SSR, which is kind of an interesting concept because it's almost like going back in time to what we used to do with things like PHP or ASP.NET. But there's value for it in the modern day. So anyway, that's kind of the idea, is that with the progressive framework, is that if you just need just the Vue rendering engine and you just need template driven changes, great, you can just use that and keep your package really small. But if you need full-blown features of a front-end framework, no problem, right? You can easily plug them in and add them into the ecosystem and kind of just have them work out of the box there.
Okay. Yeah, no, that sounds pretty complete. It sounds a lot like that maybe is not, yeah, that's why it's called a framework and not a library. And that's an important difference. Sometimes companies like to ask that at interviews. So it's definitely a JavaScript framework, since you mentioned that it provides out of the box routing, state management, the CLI that we mentioned, and these other pieces, right? So that definitely makes it a framework because it has official packages that you can use, but you can opt in, they're optional, versus other, like libraries. React is considered a library. I mean, you find any type of a package for React, you find it, you need whatever, you will find a package for it, but it's not, usually they're not official, or they're not like out of the box, or sometimes there's different alternatives. Sometimes you can say, yeah, I want to use this for my state management. Let's say I want to use Redux, or maybe I want to use the built-in state management that React offers. So there's different, alternatives, but that's kind of like the difference between framework and library. Like with library, you have more freedom and more responsibility and more chances to make mistakes if you don't know what you're doing. With a framework, usually you're more boxed and they guide you, right? You say like, oh, I need routing. This is the way you do routing in Vue. This is how you do it. You can do it other ways. There's other libraries. That's fine. But this is how you do it officially. So that's usually good for, for new graduates to pick a framework because they get to learn more. But I'm not saying don't learn React. I mean, you usually would learn React in school. So most likely you are going to be learning at your bootcamp. You're going to be learning the best practices. So those chances of making those mistakes are not as high because you have this specialized guidance during your learning process. So it's not that it's bad. It's just that usually tends to be more risky using libraries when you don't have that expertise on the team. That's usually one of the trade-offs. But like all the libraries are great and all the frameworks are welcome, right? Yeah, Jared, something I wanted to comment. Something that I always do when I'm going to use a new package or a new library or something, I always like look at the community behind it. With Angular, for example, you think like, oh yeah, Google is behind it, and it's probably the biggest project they have right now. I mean, when it comes to frameworks that are open source that people use, right? And it's backed by them. React, of course, Facebook is behind them, right? Most of the core team work at Facebook, and there's a ton of open source contributors as well, and paid contributors and sponsors. But then Vue. So usually you want to invest on something like, I want to use Vue, but I want to know that Vue is going to be there for me in 2 or 3 years when my company is successful using it. So who's behind Vue? Who's supporting it? How do they stay, like, how like all these contributors, like the core contributors, like how do they get paid, or how's this community built to make it so popular? And I'll talk more about that after you answer this, but yeah, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. No, so this is a really great question. And like you're saying, Google is behind Angular and Facebook is behind React. So that, yeah, there's going to be support for these, hopefully for a very long time. A very common joke that you'll hear about in the front end JavaScript world is, there's a new JavaScript framework every day, right? That's coming out to be able to use a framework or a library. And it's true, there are quite a few. Vue is considered, part of the top 3, as I've mentioned before. So there is a lot of popularity behind it. Now, the strength behind it, or the, what's kind of helping, give it in reliability, is the fact that, it is run independently, and it's by, the Vue core team headed up by Evan You and a lot of other great contributors that have been part of the project for nearly a decade now. The project's been running for just about 8 years now. I think 7 years officially released. And they about a year ago or so released their a little over a year ago their version 3, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. But as far as funding goes, they do accept donations from people, both corporations and individuals. GitHub has done great initiatives over the last year of helping companies be able to donate money to the creators behind these frameworks to be able to, or any front end or any library on GitHub is being able to be supported in this way. So there's, I think, a value from it being independent, where they get to make the choices that are arguably best for that framework and for its success. Whether there's not going to be any sort of necessarily influence from Facebook or Google in the directionality that they want to kind of push things. Because you can kind of see, I think, with Angular, there's been this really, really strong push towards material design, and hey, you should use material design because that's what what Google is behind and what they're using. So yeah, part of it's that. The other part of it too, of giving Vue support, is the companies that use it. So if you go and Google, companies that are using Vue JS, I mean, there's a long list. Google's using it, Apple's using it, Nintendo, GitLab. There's a lot of list of people who are using Vue. Not necessarily, of course, across their entire stack. No, right? They're going to pick a project that they want to build in Vue and say, hey, let's try this out. Let's see how this framework works. Let's see how it performs in a production environment. So it's being supported by these big companies through using it and giving it trust. Despite, again, these big companies could easily say, we're going to pick Facebook or we're going to pick Google, in their frameworks. But instead they're choosing to, use this independent framework that's, arguably hopefully going to be there no matter if Google or Facebook are there in the future.
Yeah. So that's really good information there. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. Having like a more, open source free community that is, not so controlled maybe by the organizations behind it. Usually there's some direction, right? So that's pretty cool that is so big. Something that I always check, and this is like level up part, right? To level up to land your first engineering job. There's so many JavaScript libraries out there. So always when you pick a library, make sure to check how many downloads. There's a few things to check. So the first one, check how many downloads it has per week at NPM. Second, check how big the community is in GitHub, like how many stars it has, how many contributors, and then if those check out, usually you can think that that's a safe library, that you will have some security there. It's going to be well maintained, bugs are going to be addressed, and it's going to be there tomorrow when you are using it on your production code. So with Vue, when it comes to Vue, I see that we have the classic Vue.js/Vue repo on GitHub, and that one has 184,000 stars, which I believe is like way more than Angular and way more than React, which is pretty huge, right? I mean, I don't remember the stats, but like that's a ton. I mean, 184 people have actually started on GitHub this repo, so that's huge. There's a lot of pull requests. There's a lot of commits going on. Of course, this is for version 2.6. That is, the latest version for version 2, because now we're on version 3, right? Which the latest update for version 3 was like April 1st. So looking at that one, that's Vue Next. The repo is in the same Vue.js organization /Vue-Next. Looking at that one, and I'm just doing like, if I was to use Vue, I would do this checklist, right? And why I'm saying this is because if it comes to, let's say at an interview, you listening out there, and they ask you like, what do you do to pick a library, since there's so many out there, or a framework or an NPM package? You can mention these steps, and this is a very solid answer, okay? Because that's what I do real life. That's what we do, right? To validate and to make sure that the things you can use. So with Vue Next, definitely there's not as many stars since it is a newer version, but it's still 22,000 stars. So a lot of followers, let's say, have a star. The GitHub repo is also well maintained. There's a lot of commits. Last commit I see is like 4 days ago, so that's pretty good. A lot of issues, which is good, because that means that people are using it and reporting it. Yeah, right. So don't always get scared that, oh, there's a lot of issues. No, that means that things are being reported and there's a lot of issues closed. And look at this ratio, Jared: 176 open issues or outstanding, 1436 close. So that means that this just tells me that this is actively maintained. So that like checks out. The other thing I usually like to check is the type of licensing, right? Like, is this MIT? Is this like what type of licensing this has? So Vue is MIT. So it's kind of like, okay, cool. I can use it for production code. I can use it for commercial use, modification, distribution, private use. There's no liability or warranty from the Vue creators. So, and I have to have the license on the copyright notice on the code that I consume, right? So that's pretty standard, but that checks out as well. So that's kind of like makes it very solid to use and to consume. And just looking at the npm package, just at the 2.6 version, since it is more popular, since 3 is relatively new, there's almost 2 million weekly downloads. That just tells me that like there's a ton of people using this. So those check out. So if you ever get asked at an interview, how do you pick a JavaScript library or an npm package over another, just tell them these steps, and that's a very solid answer. Okay. So Jared, now you were mentioning about the two-way binding, and I wanted to think about, like, the level up aspect. This is a question that could come up for these junior or new software engineers, right, that are applying at jobs. They might be asked like, hey, what is two-way binding, or why is it important? In fact, I think I have asked that at interviews myself. So let's answer that question, because you mentioned it, but I think we need to elaborate a bit on that to provide a level up aspect from
Yeah,
our
absolutely.
podcast.
Yeah. So just to give a little bit of a background here. So in the normal world, imagine no two-way binding. If you want to be able to change some value on the web page, on the DOM with your JavaScript, you have to go through a process of making sure that you have some ID attached to some element on the DOM. You then have to tell your JavaScript to do some sort of query selector or select by ID using the window document API. And then you can start modifying things. However, anyone who's ever done this by hand, although it's a very useful and valuable thing to understand how it's doing that, it ends up being a lot of code to manage and having to add your own custom event listeners to be reactive to things. So that's kind of the old way of doing things. jQuery came along and created a shorthand version of using the document query selector and modifying elements, but really it's still kind of a bit clunky. Two-way binding is this whole idea that was introduced, many years ago, but has been highly popularized in these front-end frameworks. And the idea is simple. In your HTML, you're going to add some special attribute, and oftentimes it's referred to as a directive in front-end JavaScript frameworks, that essentially says, hey, let's say we have an input element, a text input element for your first name. You could add a very special directive on it. And in Vue's case, you'd say v-model equals, and then you give it a name. So you could say like first name. And then in your JavaScript, you're going to create a variable in your component called first name. And Vue then is smart enough to realize that, hey, both of these things are connected. They are bound to each other. So the idea is that if I go ahead and change the input text box in the HTML, it's going to, behind the scenes, change the JavaScript value. And likewise, if I change the JavaScript value, it's going to change it on the view. This is often also called the Mvvm, the model view model two-way binding paradigm. So go ahead and take a look at that. Again, this is used across many different frameworks. And this is one reason to be able to learn Vue, is that you can come and understand these concepts, and they easily translate to other frameworks pretty much directly. Behind the scenes and under the hood, they do things slightly differently, but they're ultimately kind of accomplishing the same goal. But anything else to add to that one that I missed?
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah, you mentioned like a lot of boilerplate code to accomplish that if we didn't have the frameworks. So I would say, like, just as a nutshell, that like when you're asked that at an interview, you can include in your answer. As far like something along what Jared said, right? But including the answer that, like, when we don't have those directives or those attributes and the two-way data binding, we just end up writing a lot of more repetitive code. So that just means that code is harder to maintain, harder to read. We have to write a lot of document.get element by ID and get the node, update the inner text, then start like doing a lot of code to handle when the input changes, go update the variable. When the variable changes, go update the DOM element, right? And there's a lot of boilerplate around that. So if you want, do the exercise yourself to see how much code you need to accomplish that. And there's quite some lines. And then imagine that then maybe you put that in a function and then you repeat that across everything, right? That's a lot of repetition because you still have to consume and do other stuff, declare variables. So it's very complicated. So that's like what these libraries are doing. They're abstracting these from us, so then we can just focus on what matters, which is writing quality code that solves the business problems. So add that to your answer and you will have a really like a you will nail your answer there with the data binding, not so much about like how it works, but like also why, really like pointed to how it saves you money. Like company, look, this saves you money because of, and all the things we said, right? That's how you want to line your answers when you're interviewing. So that's okay. That's really good, Jared. So, there's a classical. I mean, we had an episode on this, but why should, like, for example, let's say I'm a new graduate and I spent 6 months learning React, and I'm gonna elaborate more on this, but why should I learn Vue JS in 2021? Like, what would be the benefit? So let's think about that and let's provide that answer for our listeners, right? Many out there that are applying for jobs and or they're looking into switching jobs. Like,
Yeah.
what would be a good thing? Let's say they already know React. What would be good? Like, why even learn Vue if I already know React and I'm applying for jobs? I'm not getting one job a job yet. I mean, there's a lot of competition, right? A lot of bootcamp graduates. So thinking about that, like the first thing that comes to mind, Jared, is like maybe, you know, I can have less competition with Vue if I want to get into my first software engineering job, right? Because there's also some demand for Vue. So let's talk about that, Jared. Like, what are your thoughts, especially? And I'm asking you this because I know that you work professionally with Angular. You were teaching React on the boot camps and on the in the high education school, and then you work with Vue, or you worked with Vue in some side projects and some consulting stuff. So what's your take on that? Like, why did you even learn Vue, right?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, from the perspective of this student you're talking about, let's say comes out of a coding boot camp, and typically speaking, most of these coding boot camps are teaching you React. So why learn Vue? Yeah, there's a lot of different reasons to learn Vue. One is that with anything in software engineering, it's important that you're continuing to challenge yourself and to learn new things. And Vue is a new thing that you can learn, that one is a practical skill that you can use to apply to jobs and to Vue specific jobs as well, and get a better chance of perhaps getting those over everyone else who's competing for the React jobs. But it's important to remember that Vue or React or Angular, at the end of the day, these are all JavaScript. Or if you're using TypeScript, they're all TypeScript, which again, well, Vue also has full support for TypeScript if you choose to use it. Out of the box, it doesn't have it, but you can choose to opt in to have it out of the box. But the point is a lot of the concepts that you're going to be learning with Vue are going to be directly translatable to other programming, front-end frameworks. So a lot of the concepts are just going to make sense, and really help continue to challenge you. Now, in my personal opinion, if I'm building a personal project, oftentimes I still like to do it in Vue. The way that you build components and you connect components, I actually really like that experience and how you plug into the different functionality of components compared to React and Angular. So sometimes if I'm working on personal projects, I'll oftentimes pick that. I also have built production applications in Vue as well, which also was a great experience. I think React has gotten a lot of popularity over the years because of its simplicity. Again, they market themselves as being a front-end UI library and not a full-on framework, which I think goes a long way. I would say that also React is much more, I like to say, I guess, JavaScripty, maybe, if there's not a better way to say it. It's very highly reliant on a lot of the ideas, which I think is great that they lean on that versus worrying so much about all the other details there. But yeah, again, there are a lot of Vue jobs out there. There's a what you can go and Google out there, Vue jobs. There's a website that regularly posts about opportunities in Vue. I know here in the Salt Lake Valley and down in Utah Valley, or the Silicon Slopes as it's dubbed these days, has a handful of companies that use Vue in production. And with Vue continuing to advance itself with version 3.0 and the composition API, which is very similar to React hooks in how they encapsulate component logic to be reused. I think there's a lot of exciting things going on for Vue to make it worthwhile to invest into.
Yeah, I was just checking that site, and just checking, like, here in the local area, there's a ton of companies that say some experience with Vue is desired. So when you see those companies, that doesn't mean like you gotta know Vue, but like if you do know some Vue, and you don't have to be an expert with it. Let's say go learn Vue for a month, play with it, build some projects. Then at the interview, you can say, "Yeah, I've used it. I know. I am familiar with it. I don't have to learn it from scratch," and that will give you points. Like you will have a head start over other candidates. And I'm just saying this like you out there, you're applying for jobs, and let's say you're having a hard time because you're applying just for React jobs, then open up to other options. Maybe Vue could be like that option for you to land your first engineering job. At times, sometimes we want certain job doing certain thing, but maybe that's not what is set out for us. Sometimes like we have to do that and a little bit more, a little bit less, something different, right? Because there's so many paths, and when you're looking for your first engineering job, you don't get to be picky, right? Because there's a lot of competition. So if you do go out there and get a job
Yeah.
in Vue, go and learn Vue and become the best engineer on Vue. And one of the things you mentioned, those are key, Jared, is that those things are translatable. That's pretty good because when you learn a framework or a library, you're not just learning how to use a framework. I want everybody like listening to this to see it this way. You're learning how the developers behind it like to do certain things. That usually means that that's a consensus. And usually those consensus, they really mean that those are best practices. So usually when you learn a library or a framework, you're learning best practices from a larger community that goes beyond that framework or library you're learning.
Yeah.
For example, you learn like, hey, you should use, they tell you like, no, make your components pure with the inputs and don't mutate this and that or something like that. You're really learning things that go beyond that. It's just a best practice, and there's a lot of reasons behind it. My experience, like when I have learned a framework or programming language and jump to a different one, I have learned so much that I'm like, for example, when I learned Ruby on Rails, I learned a lot about API development because they have a lot of out of the box things for that. And then when I learned .NET Web API, Web App API, right, to build APIs with .NET Core, then it was just like, oh, everything in here just applies there. And then it was just easier. I didn't have a hard time. I just had to learn the C# syntax, but everything else was just like the same, right? I mean, the same, right? And the best practices were the same. Like, oh yeah, this is how you respond to this, or this is the so you learn those just by learning the framework. You're expanding your experience, and you are thinking differently because you are learning this collective knowledge from all these maintainers that are behind a project. So usually learning Vue, and that's what I said. Like I spent like a month learning a little bit and using it, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, this is nice. Oh, I like this, right? I didn't dive in just because I wasn't using it professionally. I didn't really have a reason, but still, it was really good. So we're out of time. I just want to remind everybody that if you like this podcast, please follow us on whatever platform you're on so you get notified. If you're on YouTube, click the the subscribe button so you get notified, and then the little bell. If you're on an audio platform, right, on a podcast, then you subscribe so you get notified about the new episodes. And any final words, Jared, before we wrap it up?
Yeah, the last thing I would just I would say is that one other thing I really like about the Vue development is that there's a great community out there of people who are building applications and helping each other out. The documentation for Vue is spectacular. I found it to be a lot easier to use personally than even in Angular, because I feel like with Angular, there's so many different versions at this point that you have to be really specific about your searches to make sure you're getting the right resources. But that's the last bit I'd like to say about that.
Yeah, that is true. And sometimes libraries just don't work. Like you get a package and it doesn't work with this newer version, right? It happens with software. No,
Yeah.
that's awesome. I just want to finish up with saying, like, all frameworks are welcome in the JavaScript world. If you learn React, Vue, Angular, just make sure to become really good at it. Stand out when you apply to your interviews and expand your knowledge. Learn the best of each of them because they're all pretty cool. I mean, really, like, there's no like, oh, this one is better or this one, they have its strengths and they have weaknesses. Some are learning hard to learn, some are easier to learn, but they all have a lot of value. And the most important thing, they all can get you a job. So, be very open to that. So yeah, okay, awesome. So this was Dev Bootcamp Life. Thanks for joining us. I'm Juan Lizarazo,
And I'm Jared Potter.
and we'll see you next week.
Take care.